Yes, hello. Understanding why Vladimir Putin is obsessed with Ukraine, why he launched an invasion of Ukraine that has led to this European and global crisis. And I place the emphasis here on the stagnation of nationalism in Russia during Putin's presidency, back to what I would call the pre-Soviet understanding of the three Eastern Slavs. Here I mean that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are three branches of what was then used to be called a pan-Russian nation, an общий русский народ. So this is a rejection of the Soviet recognition of a separate Ukraine and a separate Ukrainian people. This is going back to late 19th, early 20th century and what was prevalent amongst white Russian emigres. This is nothing new. It's something new for some reason amongst Western policymakers and Western academics, but Vladimir Putin has been denying the existence of Ukraine and Ukrainians since at least 2008, and he has been making territorial claims for the same period of time. And the link to this is a perception that the natural state of Ukraine, what Ukraine should look like in the eyes of Russian leaders, is a country resembling Belarus under self-declared President Alexander Lukashenko. So the goal of, for example, Putin's goals of demilitarization, denazification, are to transform Ukraine into a second Belarus. That is the ultimate goal. Whether it's realistic is a separate debatable question, but that's his goal. And he really does, and they really did believe, and for many, many years in Moscow, they have believed that the majority of Ukrainians want to be part of the Russian world, want to be a part of the Russian sphere of influence, but they have been denied that right by nationalists who came to power in the Euromaidan revolution, who have made Ukraine into a US puppet state. And that is an important way of understanding how Moscow sees this crisis. It sees Ukraine as a place that has been unnaturally pulled away from Russia. Most Russians have always had difficulty in accepting an independent Ukraine. This has been true for the last 3 decades, and especially a Ukraine which is outside of the Russian sphere of influence, i.e. integrating into Europe, NATO, EU. So what do they mean by denazification? Denazification means the destruction of Ukrainian national identity, which was cultivated during 3 decades of nation building. So the transformation of Ukraine into a little Russia, as a branch of that pan-Russian nation. The installation, the replacement of Volodymyr Zelensky with a pro-Russian puppet dictator, similar to Lukashenko. That would mean, and the US intelligence has leaked this many weeks ago, a kill list. Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian civil society activists, academics, journalists who support a pro-Ukraine identity, who supported the Euromaidan revolution, who support a pro-Western orientation, are to be imprisoned and potentially executed. And those developments are already happening and beginning in areas of southern Ukraine under Russian occupation. Putin's goal is to, and he said this on many occasions, including back to his famous essay in July of last year, to get rid of this anti-Russia Ukraine. That's how he sees it. He sees the nationalists and the United States, EU, of having created this anti-Russia in Ukraine and that has to be replaced by this little Russia. That could be also linked to potentially dismembering Ukraine, with southern eastern Ukraine being more closely integrated into something that Putin revived in 2014, this so-called New Russia. Vladimir Putin and Russian leaders have said on many occasions that Soviet leaders were wrong to include southern and eastern Ukraine within the Ukrainian state. Denazification, once that is implemented, is supposed to then lead to demilitarization, which would be the creation of this so-called neutral state, which would no longer seek NATO membership. But it's not just NATO. It would be no longer seeking also EU membership. Because remember, back in 2013-14, Russia applied intense pressure on President Yanukovych to reject the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and to then turn Ukraine eastwards towards joining the Eurasian Economic Union. Putin wants to see Ukraine, Kiev, the so-called mother of Russian cities, as part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and the Russian world as the core central three countries of the Eurasian Economic Union. And without Ukraine, that in Putin's eyes, that's wrong. Putin sees himself as this, and he wants to see himself going into Russian history as the gatherer of Russian lands. Crimea 2014, Belarus 2020, and Ukraine now. So this entire criminal invasion is all linked to an imperial nationalism that really is completely out of place in a postmodern European Union. Why did the invasion begin now? Well, I believe that there are many factors, and I list them in one of these slides. But in particular, the Russian Vladimir Putin has been increasingly isolated in the last few years. He's become increasingly obsessed with Ukraine, reading this émigré and Russian nationalist literature. You saw that in his long essay published last year. President Zelensky organized criminal charges of treason against Vladimir Putin's representative in Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk. 4 pro-Russian television channels were banned. Putin takes all of these actions as very personal. I think another red line for Putin was the launch of the Crimean platform in August of last year to raise international publicity about Crimea. And then also in October, Ukraine began using Turkish-made drones to counterattack when there was enemy fire on its positions in the Donbass. So I think a combination of those, plus I think in the Kremlin and Putin, they believed that using the Minsk agreements and low-level military pressure in the Donbass had failed to achieve Russia's goals. And Russia's goals were always not compromise, but Ukraine to capitulate and become this second Belarus. So hence the artificial crisis began in November of last year. And it was a completely artificial crisis because Ukraine was never going to be given NATO membership at the time. There was no US missiles going to Ukraine, and Ukraine had been cooperating militarily with NATO for 30 years. So nothing new had happened except in Putin's change and evolution. This is a different Putin, a more dictatorial Putin compared to 2014. And I think there's a strong interconnection between domestic repression in Russia since the changing of the constitution in 2020 and the move towards a dictatorship in Russia and external aggression. They're closely connected between the two. Vladimir Putin has completely miscalculated in this crisis. He's miscalculated in 3 ways. Firstly, with the Russian people. This is not going to be a popular war in Russia. This is not the same as in 2014, which was popular. I think your previous speakers are being a bit too liberal on this question, unfortunately. Support in Russia for the occupation of Crimea has remained steady over the last 8 years at 85% support. Even opposition leader Alexei Navalny supports the occupation of Crimea. So let's not have illusions about this. But Russia's invasion today will not generate that same mobilization of Russian nationalism as the Crimea, because the Crimea has a very special link to Russian national identity. So that's one thing in Russia. And of course, the impact of the Western sanctions is another miscalculation. Vladimir Putin expected, and Russian leaders expected, that the West would be divided, the West would again implement very weak sanctions, as it did in 2014. The sanctions in 2014 were, I'm sorry to say, quite pathetic in response to what happened in Ukraine. Today they are not, but they expected in Moscow that the sanctions would be again weak and there would be dissenters in Europe. Remember, after 2008 in Georgia, there were no sanctions. 2014, there were weak sanctions. And now, finally, we have strong sanctions. So they miscalculated again there. Miscalculated in Russia, miscalculated in the West. The third miscalculation was inside Ukraine. Because of this Russian nationalist mythology that Ukrainians don't exist as a separate people, they believed that Russian troops would be seen as liberators, that they would be greeted with flowers. Instead, they were greeted with Turkish drones and Western Stingers and javelins. And I think that there's a shock in the Russian army at the strength of the Ukrainian anger and resistance to this invasion. They simply never expected it to be like this. And you see that on the Ukrainian side, there's high morale, high determination, a lot of anger. On the Russian side, there isn't that high morale. You see this in the dejection amongst Russian soldiers. Putin has a major conundrum now, and I'll end here. Macho men like Vladimir Putin find it practically impossible to retreat. How can they say they made a mistake? He's already blaming the mistakes in Ukraine. Remember that they expected that Kiev and Ukraine would be occupied and captured within 1 to 2 days. It's now third week. And the level of casualties of Russian soldiers is already higher than what the US suffered over 8 years in Iraq and over 20 years in Afghanistan. It's practically 60% of Soviet casualties in Afghanistan after 8 years. So this is very, very bad, and a lot of also equipment lost. So Putin's conundrum, things are not going well. Can he retreat? Macho men don't retreat. Can he go forward? That's also problematical because Kiev is not Aleppo or Grozny. Aleppo and Grozny were less than 1 million populations. Kiev is 4 million. So it's a much bigger city to capture, far more problematical. Resistance will be very high, and Russian troops would suffer tremendous losses. Yes, of course, there would be probably a lot of destruction of Kiev from this. But how would this respond back in Russia? How would it look in Russia that the Russian leader is destroying the so-called mother of Russian cities, the city that's supposed to be where the 3 Eastern Slavs were created in Kiev Rus? And if Putin is seen as destroying that, I think that will undermine his legitimacy. So he has a major conundrum what to do, and this is why there doesn't seem to be much real strategy as to where Russia is going in this conflict, except by unveiling massive destruction on buildings and on the civilian population. So I will, I think, end it on this question. The driving factor in all of this war is Putin's personal obsession with taking back what he sees as Little Russia, Ukraine. And because of that, we have this tremendous tragedy unfolding in Ukraine and this tremendous tragedy in Europe and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now our next speaker will be Ludmila Pitkuimukar. Please, you have the floor. Is she connected? Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Pikunmika, you can press on the speak button at the bottom of your page now. Your connection is open. Thank you.
Please, can you press the speak button?
Yes, I pressed it. Can you hear me? I pressed the speak button.
Can hear you. It's fine. We can hear you and we can see you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here today to outline the main historical myth in the Kremlin propaganda, as well as to characterize the main channels and platforms through which these myths have been spread. In addition, I will indicate how manipulation of history has become one of the instruments for Russia's intervention in Ukraine and served as a pretext for the current war. In the address to the Russians after the Russian Security Council meeting on the February 21st, Vladimir Putin described his version of the history of Ukraine. According to his words, Ukraine was allegedly created by Lenin, who gave it too much autonomy in the Soviet state. By saying that Ukraine had not existed before, Putin declared that it was purely Russian territory. Thus, he tried to lay the foundations for a possible large-scale attack, which began on the 24th of February. Many Russians see Ukraine as a little brother, Little Russian, as Professor Koza has already mentioned, who must obey the elder or it will be forced to do so. In the meantime, Russia has proclaimed itself a world power. Next slide, please. The ideology of uniqueness of the Russian civilization is reflected in the national security strategy from the 2nd of July last year, and information and psychology sabotage and westernization of culture by the Russian Federation of its cultural sovereignty. Attempts to falsify Russian world history, distort the historical truth, and destroy historical memory, incite inter-ethnic and interfaith conflicts, weaken the state-forming people, have become more frequent. The next slide, please. In Vladimir Putin's article on the history unity of Russians and Ukrainians that has been already mentioned today from the 12th of July, the history of Russian-Ukrainian relations is dominated by the claim that Ukrainians are an Asian, inseparable part of the triune Russian nation. According to the Kremlin narrative, this community is based on a common history spanning 1,000 years, the language, the Russian ethnic identity, the shared cultural sphere, and the Orthodox religion. The next slide, please. In this presentation, I have distinguished three main manipulative techniques or myths in the Kremlin narration that Ukraine or Ukraine stands for Ukraina, outskirt. Actually, I don't want to pay so much attention because the theory have been already disproved by Ukrainian as well as by European linguists. The second manipulation is about similarities and common language for all Slavic peoples. Alexei Shakhmatov's theory of the origin of East Slavic languages, according to which all East Slavic peoples, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, and their languages originate from all-Russian unity and all-Russian proto-language became known at the basis of Russian imperial policy, Soviet policy, and actually the current Putin's policy. This theory has been also already disproved by American and Ukrainian linguists. So we can come to the next point, which is the imperial interpretation of Kievan Rus as the cradle of three fraternal peoples, Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian, which remains a canonical historical scheme in the Russian Federation. This mean had been actively used not only in the aforementioned article by Vladimir Putin, but also in his earlier speeches, I assume since 2008, Russian Orthodox Church, media, education, etc. Soviet myth of Russian-Ukrainian so-called fraternal brotherhood that deny Ukrainian right to independence and depict Russians and Ukrainians as one people, один народ, are pervasive in the Putin's article, as well as all Kremlin propaganda. After the Russian Federation started its full-scale war in Ukraine, the Kremlin decided to justify its actions by resorting to well-known theses and manipulations in the frame of all Russian open lesson Defenders of Peace for school children that was held on the 3rd of March this year. And actually during this lesson, the teachers spoke about the so-called liberation mission in Ukraine and why it was necessary. In order to impose a strong impact on the youngest groups of population, Russia used the narratives you were able to see on that slide. The next slide, please. Another channel for spreading the government's narratives and historical myth to influence not only pupils but also other strata of society is Kremlin-sponsored media that have been and remain the most powerful tool for Russian propaganda. The idea of the Ukrainian and Russian likeness is a major component, for instance, in the analyzed program Надо поговорить, we need to talk, and is realized at the level of word combinations such as Ukrainians are like Russians, the fraternal people, we think alike, one nation, common families, movies, holidays, we are all one, etc. In the aforementioned program, guest and the host were discussing love, friendship, relationships, whatever, but did not resort to politics, and to the analysis of the causes that led to the Russian-Ukrainian war. This is in line with the concept of the Kremlin propaganda and Kremlin manipulation techniques, that the viewer is given a ready-made and clear idea rather than a possibility to think, analyze for themselves what indeed is unfolding around them. The next slide, please. In addition to the media, mass culture also plays an important role in establishing Russia as a superpower and a successor of Kievan Rus. The image of Prince Volodymyr, called also Volodymyr the Great, who baptized the Rus, has been actively used recently in the cartoons, fiction films, documentaries, and even games. Some of the examples you are able to see on this slide. Volodymyr the Great was recalled by Putin as the powerful gesture of a timeless superhero who predetermines the overall basis of the cultural civilization and human values that unite the peoples of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The end of the quote. And actually, there is nothing to say that such concepts as Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus did not exist at that time. It is worth mentioning that the Russian Federation has been actively constructing monuments to Volodymyr the Great in recent 10 years, and actually currently there are twice as many monuments in Russia than in Ukraine. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as counted, 15 against 8. The next slide, please. And actually the final one. Timothy Snyder emphasized that the story by Putin's article reveals how early Russia is in the development of its own national story. The way that Mr. Putin tells his story, Ukraine is a kind of crutch. Belarus is a kind of crutch. Russia is unable to tell its story about itself, so the story he told relies upon other peoples. Thus, the Russian propaganda machine, like its Soviet predecessor, is falsifying historical facts and distorting data in order to demonstrate Ukraine's inferiority, minimize its culture, and distort its language. These narratives are spread through various platforms and channels, as you have noticed, education, mass media, and mass culture. As a result of the Kremlin propaganda, Ukraine is not capable of banking on an independent future and separate development. I would just like to finish with the words of Raimonda Milignaite. I hope I pronounced correctly her name, Information and Communication Officer of the East Stratcom, who said, "For the Kremlin, history is not something to be studied and remembered, but something to be managed to justify Russia's current actions." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this insight you gave us. And now I pass the floor to Emilia Kustova. She's representative of the Russian organization Memorial International and at the moment professor at the University of Strasbourg. You remember Memorial is also one of the one organization who got the Sakharov Prize of the European Parliament. So please, Mrs. Kustova, you have the floor. Please press the speak button.
Bonjour, mesdames, messieurs. Thank you very much for this invitation. Just wanted to check that you can hear me. Okay, thank you. Merci beaucoup. Alors, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world is discovering the place that history occupies in the official Russian narrative and the extent of its distortion. These speeches about history have been constructed over the last few years, over 10 years. The arrival of Putin to power in 2000 was already accompanied by some signs announcing the instrumentalization of history. And this would be the content of future Russians' novels. And Putin insisted on the role of history in teaching, and he promoted at the center of his narrative references to the major patriotic war, which is what they call the Second World War still in Russia. But for them, it started in 1941 rather than 1939. So there were people talking about this, and there was a fight against the falsification of history in 2009, but the room for maneuver for civil society was still quite broad during the first decade of Putin's rule. After that, the regime became tougher, and laws restricting freedoms were adopted in 2011-2012, and the distortion of history became explicit. Putin often spoke about Russia's past and its place in society and contemporary society. He declared, for example, at the beginning of 2013 that the main source of power and the future of Russia resides in our historical memory. So history becomes a resource just like oil. And this desire to put history at the service of patriotic education and legitimizing governmental policy in so doing has led to the deployment of a whole range of tools to spread the Russian narrative and to limit the scope of dissenting voices, particularly the voices of Memorial. And this served to construct the patriotic narrative. Commemorations, school books, monuments, museums traditional things, and others are more innovative. For example, the creation in 2012 of two institutions presented as being autonomous, although they are not independent, the Russian History Society and the Russian Military History Society. Both of them come under strongmen of the regime, Nashkin on the one hand and Vladimir Nizhitsky on the other hand. And these institutions play a key role in the instrumentalization of history in Russia. Other tools are used, for example, exhibitions which first show in Moscow and then are reproduced elsewhere. All this serves to introduce a narrative, a vision of a military state power which goes back thousands of years, back to the Russia of Kiev. And at the center of this, or what they value, is everything which makes the Russian state strong and powerful, both within the country and on the international stage. This narrative also condemns any popular movement which may contest it. Of course, the major patriotic war occupies an essential place. It already had its place during the Soviet era, but it was weakened a bit during perestroika and the 90s. So the idea is to construct an building, an edifice of identity. This is why Stalin is often rehabilitated, not systematically, until recently at least, and this is why violence of Stalin's policy is often attenuated. The victory in 1945 is seen as a new beginning with re-establishment of the imperial territory, with some exceptions, and new legitimacy paid in blood. And the idea is to save a world from fascism, and the Russian nature has therefore gained a place amongst the great. It is now definitively in the camp of the forces of good, which makes it unacceptable to re-evaluate its role during the conflict, and any dispute of current policies is dealt with likewise. So this crucial role in the war is used to justify the first attack against Ukraine in 2014, and it's happening again now. So it's the main crimes against history are also linked to the Ukrainian war. That was in the report of the which was published in 2021 of the FIDH. And of course, this led to the liquidation of Memorial. There are certain typologies of measures against freedom. For example, the collection of information, making it more difficult to gain access to the archives, and also spreading knowledge with censorship and criminalization of certain narratives. There's also part of the general legal framework, which has become increasingly oppressive since 2012. And also there's what is linked to the history of Memorial itself. For example, the law on foreign agents adopted in 2012, which made it much more difficult for NGOs to function, including Memorial, which finally led to the splitting up, the closure of that NGO. All these tools are obstacles, therefore, for the activities of Memorial and other independent stakeholders in the historical domain. Apart from these general tools which restrict freedom, others have been used on an ad hoc way to do away with any narrative which does not conform to the official one. In 2014, of course, first attack against Ukraine, it was crucial because it was then that a law was adopted, although it was dormant for several years before that, criminalizing the rehabilitation of Nazism, and uses very vague notions which allows you to punished with up to 50 years imprisonment of anything which moves away from the official narrative and which can be designated as spreading information which is knowingly false on the activities of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. So that you can understand that with a war like this, it is no longer possible to truly study the history of the Second World War. And in 2020, amendments to the Constitution were made, which were already mentioned by Professor Cortio. These amendments postulate that the mission of the Russian Federation is to protect historical truth, and one of the amendments does not allow minimalizing the heroism of the people, and there again we think of the Second World War. And the toolbox was completed in 2020, and it was therefore ready to be mobilized to impose a single vision of history, crushing any alternatives and any desire to adopt a professional humanist view on universal Russian history, as has always been done by Memorial, and I hope Memorial will continue to do so. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you for your lecture. And before I open the questions, we also have Mrs. Martina Bildziukiewicz. Please try and stick to 5 minutes so people still have the possibility of asking questions, and then we can take some answers as well.
Bildziukiewicz.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you perfectly.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I will try to be brief, especially given that many very important points were raised already. So maybe just an additional perspective from strategic communications task force. We deal with pro-Kremlin Russia's disinformation since 2015. And what we see, and actually my colleague Raimonda Miglinaite was quoted already, we see that the Kremlin has been trying to manage history for years. The political leadership in Russia uses history as a political instrument to foster legitimacy at home and to frame Russia's international role. And historic revisionism is integrated into Russia's domestic and foreign policy. Domestically, the goal is mostly to consolidate the nation under the banner of patriotism against an external enemy. And here I'm going to use quite often one word that is very disturbing for us Europeans, and this is the word Nazi. This has been a prevalent narrative very aggressively pushed by the Kremlin for a few years, but especially right now. I will come back to this. Internationally, Russia aims to create an image of itself as a sole force of resistance against Nazism, both now and throughout history. So anyone questioning the role of the USSR, for example, in World War II and its aftermath, is a target of disinformation attacks coming both from the media loyal to the Kremlin and from the official sources. That, by the way, included the European Parliament a few years ago when the resolution on the importance of European remembrance for the future of Europe was adopted back in 2019. We have seen similar narratives pushed by the Kremlin and its media for years. I've said that already. Examples would include the case of the illegal annexation in Crimea in 2014 under the pretext of a neo-Nazi coup, which is how pro-Kremlin outlets and the Kremlin administration portrays Maidan. It's how they call the Maidan Revolution. And those efforts intensified in 2019 and 2020 in line with relevant narratives of World War II, as well as preparation for constitutional changes and presidential elections in Russia. And again, those narratives appeared in the build-up to the war, especially in the last few months. More specifically, when we take a look at the last 3 months before Putin attacked Ukraine again, we can see that throughout the ecosystem of the Kremlin's media, the number of mentions of the word Nazi grew by 290%. This clearly shows where this information machine wanted to go to justify the war, to make us, and especially the Russian audience, believe that Nazis rule Ukraine and therefore need to be toppled. This made-up narrative continues also throughout the war, and the most gruesome example of last days is Russia's attack on the maternity ward in Mariupol, which was explained, quotation marks here, by Russian authorities and their media as the need to clear the area from neo-Nazis. So basically they lie to our faces and they use those lies to justify violence and murder. My team in Stratcom Task Force, which is part of the European External Action Service, has been consistently monitoring and analyzing pro-Kremlin campaigns, including those campaigns of historical revisionism, in our publicly available database of disinformation cases, which we are working on since 2015. We collected a few hundreds of examples of disinformation related to historical revisionism. And we regularly publish products to raise awareness about the Kremlin's attempt of historical revisionism. I can go into details if there are questions or if there's any need for me to go into details. We also share regularly with EU institutions and member states our findings, and most importantly, we try as much as we can to raise awareness about this issue, because historical revisionism and lies about history are an inherent part of Russia's disinformation campaigns, and we see them very much reflected in the current war again. I will stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ich glaube, es war sehr wichtig.
I think it was very important for us to hear all of these presentations to get a general view of how history can be manipulated and how manipulating narrative can be used as a justification for war and abuse of human rights. So I think we've seen this in the past. We have to ensure that we don't just see one narrative, but we have to address history from different angles and in a critical way. So now I would like to give the floor to our political groups. Thomas Wandkowski, 2 minutes. Please stick to the time, because we don't have much time left.
Bardzo dziękuję wszystkim ekspertom.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank all the experts for having made their presentations. It seems that Putin is trying to carve out his place in history by returning Russia to its right status. As Professor Kutsia said, Ukraine is only the beginning of this historical revisionism crusade, and is he going to go further towards Moldavia and Moldova or Georgia, and what can the European institutions do to thwart this propaganda? I also would like to ask Mrs. Ludmila, you said that to a great extent this propaganda begins at school. Obviously this is present in the media and in mass culture, popular culture. What are the chances of accessing independent sources, and what are the chances of reducing the impact of Russian propaganda? Yesterday we saw the brave journalist who rushed on to the stage with a placard saying that this was all fake and against the war. And what kind of impact will this have on the consciousness of Russians? And I would like to ask all experts about the possible scenarios for the future. Do you expect Russians to begin to see what's going on, or will they go more towards this patriotism which we just heard about?
Herzlichen Dank vor allen Dingen bei den Vortragenden für diese wirklich.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these very informative contributions. I think they've illustrated that the narrative, which is at the root of this war, started beforehand. But clearly, this is a picture of history and a picture of human beings which has no place in modern times. It's not about peace, welfare, quality of life, democracy, peaceful living together. It's about territory expansion, and it's an interruption of history, and the EU is an answer to this. If I go everywhere in Europe, I can come across lots of battlegrounds which achieved nothing apart from many deaths. Of course, we've got videos and TV being used to spread the narrative, and we have to counter that. And despite our good political education and academic education, there are lots of stereotypes around, and even the best education can often not overcome these stereotypes. And these stereotypes are arising from the war. And as has been said already, I think it's important to include the Russian speakers in our countries and inform them that so that they can get a different picture to this official narrative. So my questions refer to one aspect which hasn't yet been mentioned, or only briefly, which is religion. Putin is tried to use orthodoxy in other member states of the EU to influence those countries. And on the Soviet view of history, what about the Hitler-Stalin Pact? Is that a topic being used at the moment? And also, how much in danger are the Baltic countries plus Finland? And another issue is that the term Nazis has been used on many occasions. In the Russian Federation, is there any anti-Semitic group or groups, or are there far-right organizations which use violence? And also this picture of neo-Nazis in Ukraine, are there any reasons to suspect that that was the case in a recent Ukrainian history? Thank you very much. It is important for us to take a look at our own history. Thank you. Renew Bernard Getter.
Nein? Dann für die
ID. Nobody has asked for the floor. Is anybody connected from ID who would like to speak on behalf of that group? Apparently not. Greens, same applies. Nobody? Would anybody like to speak on behalf of the Greens? No. Andrei Slabakov, ECR.
Mr. Slabakov, in order to take the floor, you need to activate your camera and your microphone. If you can hear me, to do that, you need to go on the upper left corner where you see the gear settings icon. Yes, now you should be able to take the floor.
Mr. Slabakov, please press the speak button.
Grazie, onorevole Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. I'm afraid the speaker is just impossible to hear.
Това е истината. И аз съм малко изненадан от подхода при това изслушване. Сякаш в опит да се борим с пропагандата, идваща от Русия.
Now, if we are to fight the propaganda and what comes from Russia, we are ready to create propaganda on our own. Do not forget that in any conflict there are two sides. Ukraine and Russia, let us not delude ourselves, are very close, and this is not only due to geography. Three countries there, Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, are looking for Kiev Rus for their historic roots. I am against all types of wars, and I think that this is disgusting because the people who suffer the most are the citizens, civilians, they are the people who die. The propaganda on behalf of Russia manipulates history in order to achieve political aims and to find a reasonable explanation for such an invasion. I don't believe that we should also turn what is going on into a narrative. We know that Ukraine would like to join the Western world. They would like to separate themselves from the former USSR. They want to have a future in the Western European area, but at the same time they should not denote their past. I will finish with the words of an Italian journalist, if I heard rightly, Fauci, and I will switch to Italian.
What happens in the world? It can be seen from 3 points of view: mine, yours, and the truth.
Leider ist die Verbindung unterbrochen worden.
Connections are broken, unfortunately, so I'll give the floor to Mr. Getter.
Sorry about this confusion just now, but let me try and underscore an important point. So all these analyses of historical revisionism should not allow us to believe that these activities concern only don't concern the majority, only a minority, not even a strong minority. Let's just have a look at a few points. Why is it that Mr. Putin has banned the word war? It's illegal to say the word war. I mean, it's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, he said, look, there was a drugged Nazi in power in Kiev, so it's not illegitimate to launch a war against a drug addict Nazi who happens to be in power in Kiev. Now, if he doesn't introduce the word war, it is because this word is extremely unpopular in Russia today. And then the other thing, a couple of days ago, can't remember exactly when it was, you'll excuse me for this, I think it was on the 8th of March, on International Women's Day. Why was it then that he said that conscripts will not be sent to the front, to this war, which is not actually a war in the Ukraine? Well, first of all, it was a lie. We know perfectly well that a huge number of conscripts were sent out to this front. And why did he take this precaution? Why? Because he's afraid. And quite rightly so. He's quite worried about the same thing happening now as what happened in Afghanistan when young conscripts were coming back from Afghanistan in body bags. Mr. Putin is perfectly aware of the fact, well, to be polite, how can I put it? Well, perhaps I won't be polite. He's perfectly aware of the fact that the rubbish which he's spewing on Ukraine and on Russia and on the history of these two countries, the utter garbage, is not widely shared in Russia at all. As just in the same way as what Mr. Zemmour in France utters is not particularly agreed with in that country. And let's be let's be aware of all of this. And I would like to express my thanks to the chair for having organised this debate and this exchange of views, and have an idea about what is going on in the brain of the person who is ruling Russia at the moment. But let's not say it's the fault of the Russians themselves.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Milan Zver.
Hvala za besedo, spoštovana gospa predsedujoča.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor, Madam Chair. Thank you very much to all of the speakers for their presentations. Here in the Culture Committee, I never thought we would speak about war, but today we are witnesses to such a discussion, and this is right. It's right to discuss this, Madam Chair. I'd like to briefly inform you that 3 Prime Ministers are travelling to Kiev today: Czech Republic, Poland and Slovenia. This is a very courageous act. We hope that the objective of that mission will be achieved. I would like to ask the professor, do you think that the West has reacted properly and correctly to Putin's threats over the past 14 years? I don't believe they have. I think that the intelligence services have analysed things incorrectly and politicians haven't listened. Thank you very much, Mr. Zver. The left didn't register a speaker, so I didn't see Mr. Merzi. And then Dominic.
Much. First of all, I would like to make a remark. All this analysis about nationalism, historical memory, history teaching as a tool in the hands of nationalist elites is very common for every single nation state. There's nothing unique in Russia about that. We experience this in the different parts of the world, and still we're experiencing it today. Very rightly, we see the reference to Eric Zemmour, how much his discourse has in common with discourse of Putin, or I could say Turkish President Erdogan or others. So, and again, I go back to the founders of the EU, that they knew nationalism means war. And either we defeat nationalism or we are defeated by nationalism. So this is first thing to say. Now I have some questions, short questions. First one goes about certain Ivan Ilin, whose grave was transported to Russia by Putin 2005. From abroad, and he was a well-known Christian fascist adoring Hitler, and I found out that actually Putin is referring to his writings from time to time. I wanted to know, is really Ilin a kind of philosopher influencing Putin and Putin's ideological formation? My second question is about the anti-Western dimension of Russian nationalism. I think that goes back in history. How strong is anti-Western emotions in Russia? And my third question would be about the Russian minority in Ukraine. How much their rights are protected democratically in Ukraine or not? Is there unsolved issues such as language or cultural identities? Is Ukraine a multicultural democracy or needs to be one? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dominic Ruiz-Tevesa.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta, y gracias.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'd like to thank all the experts who've already spoken. And as Bernard Guetta, my friend and colleague, said, I'm delighted that this meeting is being held because historical revisionism is, in some ways, a cultural diversion. It's another weapon in the war chest of President Putin. I would like to avail myself of the presence of our guests to talk about two possible initiatives that we could take on our side, given that, as we have heard, there is official history, which is the only version permitted, a very biased version, as we've seen in Russia. So how can the EU help to develop, together with organizations such as Memorial, how can we support European and Russian history with academics and people from Russian civil society? The project that the French presidency proposed, the Commission on European History, that could be a space for dialogue and collaboration. And we could also suggest, you and I are on the board of the European House. Perhaps the European House of History could also address the topic of historical revisionism given the current circumstances.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. I think in this House, on several occasions, we have discussed how to deal with teaching history, even in European states. And I think that in the committee we had a dispute with the Polish Ministry for Education, and this was about history being taught from one perspective. Europe is built on a consensus on presenting different points of view, different perspectives on history. Obviously, the perspective of the victor of a war is different from the country that loses the war, or the countries that were attacked have different perspectives than the attackers. But now, you could say that Rome could attack us because previously everything was Roman, or Charlemagne could have, for example, Germany and France together. Now, this is obviously all very arbitrary because we have international treaties, international agreements, and this is what should count. What should count is what we have agreed upon, not about what happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. History has been so varied in Europe, and often the continent reacted more unified in the past than we have done in recent history. So all sides of history need to be taught. We need to also understand the perspective of how, for example, how history teaching is manipulated. And certain narratives are used to spread political propaganda, or in this case, to actually pursue a war. And I think it's very important to look at that. I'd like to thank all of our speakers and experts today for their presentations. I think it really helped us all to learn about the background to the situation. And now, in reverse order, because perhaps we won't have interpretation very soon, and we'll need to continue working in English. Would somebody else like to take the floor? Have I missed somebody? Okay, now then, first of all, I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Kustova, and then I give the floor, Ms. Pidquimuka, and then Mr. Kuzio. So, Ms. Kustova, you have the floor.
Oui, merci. Alors,
thank you. So I'll reply to some of the questions or remarks which have been made. Certainly not all of them. I think all of these questions are extremely interesting and obviously very complex too, especially regarding all the possible scenarios. But specifically,
effectivement, c'est le premier nom qui sort quand on cherche à comprendre les lectures de Vladimir Poutine et les influences qu'il a subies ou qu'il a cherchées depuis une vingtaine d'années. Donc effectivement, ce philosophe Ilyine, philosophe plutôt assez marginal, y compris au sein de l'émigration dite blanche, philosophe d'extrême droite, il a influencé. Il est lu par Poutine et il est maintenant complètement apparaît comme étant légitime en Russie à tel point que il est cité jusqu'au manuel scolaire, etc. Alors, dimension anti-occidentale de cette propagande et de ce récit, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, ce sentiment peut être assez fort. Il s'appuie bien sûr sur l'héritage soviétique. Je pense que dans les années 90, on a tous surévalué cette ouverture que beaucoup ont vécue, mais qui n'a pas été cette ouverture vers l'Europe, vers l'Occident, vers le monde, que certains ont partagé, mais qui a été pour d'autres vite compromise par les difficultés socio-économiques. Et ensuite, ce sentiment, ce désarroi et ce sentiment anti-occidental et surtout anti-américain hérité de l'Union soviétique, il a été très fortement alimenté, instrumentalisé, attisé par le discours officiel, surtout depuis donc les années 2010. Ce qui a été dit sur la nécessité d'aider une réflexion et un travail historien, ça me semble extrêmement important et il me semble essentiel que ce soit l'Europe qui soutienne collectivement cet effort pour faire avancer la recherche sur l'histoire est-européenne, russe, soviétique, européenne. Globalement, c'est vraiment essentiel. C'est bien sûr un travail qui demande beaucoup de délicatesse, puisque, vous l'avez évoqué, il y a beaucoup de points de conflits, de mémoire et de récits potentiels. Pour moi, la plupart du temps, cette difficulté à construire, à écrire une histoire européenne, ça tient à des héritages de discours nationaux, parfois nationalistes, qui ne sont pas l'apanage de la seule Russie. Donc c'est une histoire aussi plurielle qu'il faut qu'on écrive, mais sur une base commune. Et enfin, je me permets de réagir à la réflexion de M. Guetta, que je partage, mais en partie. Je suis tout à fait d'accord avec, bien sûr, l'idée qu'on ne peut en aucun cas assimiler la politique de Vladimir Poutine au choix de la société russe et de la population russe. Et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec votre analyse concernant la crainte exprimée par le gouvernement de Vladimir Poutine pour de susciter les réactions similaires à celles qu'avait provoqué la guerre en Afghanistan, par exemple. Je pense cependant que malheureusement, cette vision de l'histoire, peut-être pas dans ses traits les plus caricaturaux, mais cette vision finalement très nationaliste de l'histoire, elle est partagée par beaucoup de gens en Russie, beaucoup de mes compatriotes. Ceci ne veut pas dire qu'ils sont tous d'accord de sacrifier leur vie ou les vies de leurs enfants sur l'autel de la grande Russie et de la grande histoire russe. Et là-dessus, je vous rejoins parfaitement. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. The next is Ludmila
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I just wanted to say that you really pronounce great my last name. Usually people make really many mistakes in that. Answering the question how youth is able to get information and like not Kremlin propaganda information, actually nowadays we can see that it's a bit difficult because as far as you probably know that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram that are very, very popular among young people are forbidden in Russia and people have no access. So even criminal liability for spreading so-called fakes against Russian army or saying truth about the war in Ukraine is announced in Russia. So nowadays it's a bit tough for school children, for youth to get information because most of them is getting that information from social media. Speaking about religion and how important it is for Russia, I guess Professor Kuzov would answer more in details because he is dealing with that topic more than me. But I have mentioned that actually there is like increasing of monuments to Volodymyr the Great, who baptized the Rus, and like also this myth about unite Orthodox Church and for all three peoples, Ukrainian and Russians, is also a kind of myth in current Russian manipulation machine. Also, briefly answering like to Andrei Slabakov question why Ukrainians wanna go European way. Yes, we said yes to European way in 2013 when the Revolution of Dignity or Euromaidan started, and why we didn't value our history. I just wanna say that we do not refuse our past. We are proud of our past. We just don't want Russia steal our history and steal our past and use it like against it. While preparing this presentation, I read also an article by Bernard-Henri Lévy, French philosopher, writer, publicist, who wrote, let me quote, "Ukraine, Putin says, has a common history with Russia. But this is the story of colonization. Under Bolsheviks, anarchists from Odessa were swept away with an iron boom. And then there was Stalin, the Holodomor, which killed around 6 million people." So if you are talking about common history with Russia, that is our common history with Russia. Also, I would like briefly say about state and status of Russian national minority in Ukraine. Unfortunately, there was no census since 2001, and I can't say for sure how many ethnic Russians live in Ukraine, but I can say for sure that very many people speak Russian. They are not ethnic Russians, they just speak Russian because of Bolshevik language policy and Soviet language policy because of Russification. And I was dealing a bit with like Russian media in Ukraine. So I just briefly in 2019, unfortunately I don't have like right now an appropriate statistics, but in 2019 there were more than 300 papers published in Russian, and the number of copies of to be perfectly honest, there were more Ukrainian papers, but the number of copies of Russian papers and magazines was higher than even Ukrainian. And also in 2016, it was the survey Russophone Identity in Ukraine in the context of the armed conflict in the east of the country. And there were like focus groups with people from Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Kyiv, actually those regions who are mostly bombed bombed right now, and people noted that they are not discriminated against on the grounds of language, and therefore there is no need to preserve or protect the Russian language. And speaking also about the law on education and about the language law, I wanted to say that actually this law no way forbids using Russian, Hungarian, Romanian or other languages, but requires Ukrainian citizens to know Ukrainian. And actually these laws are aimed at protecting minorities and integrate their representatives into Ukrainian society, and on the other hand to protect and unite Ukraine. And I would like to say that political, social, education and cultural rights of the national minorities in Ukraine are respected. Unfortunately, there is not so much time to go in details, but there are 2 articles I have already published on that question, and they are available in internet. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these clear words. And now, Taras Kuzio.
Mr. Kuzio,
please can you press the speak button?
It's pressed. Okay. I think that, is that okay?
Fine, we can hear you and we can see you.
Okay. I think that there are many good-hearted liberal but quite naive people listening to this regarding attitudes inside Russia. I've already mentioned that in the last 8 years there's been a steady 85% support for Russia's annexation of Crimea, and it would be ridiculous to assume there's no connection between what happened in 2014 and what happened now. In 2014, Vladimir Putin raised and he described southeastern Ukraine in Tsarist terms as New Russia. He didn't then invade and occupy the region. Now he's doing that. So there's a direct connection between the two. I think Russian people should understand that. Secondly, there is one independent sociological service in Russia called the Levada Center. I cite them all the time, and they have found majorities of Russians supporting the separation of occupied